So why am I talking about listening? Because listening is the other side of the equation of storytelling. You can't have one without the other. And in fact, for us at Narativ, listening always comes first. But it is a bit of a chicken and the egg, as we call it. Which comes first? Without listening, why would you be speaking? But without speaking, what is there to listen to? Both of those two things are inseparably connected. And I rather cheekily took the old philosophical idea about the tree falling in the forest, and I twisted it in terms of leaders telling stories. If a leader tells a story in a forest, are they really a leader? So at Narativ, we have this core principle, which is that there is a reciprocal relationship between listening and telling. And that means that the dynamic between those two activities is absolutely linked. And we're really interested in exploring the dynamic. So today we're going to start with this idea of listening, that listening is generative. Listening is the space that you create into which other people speak. I'm going to tell you a story. So 20 years ago, I was sitting in a small flat in South London, and I was watching a woman in her early 80s unpacking her shopping, and she was taking out tins of salmon and blocks of margarine and packets of biscuits and cleaning products. And she was telling me stories from her life. I was sitting on her sofa. I had a small recorder on the table between us, little red light flashing, and she told me stories of growing up in an orphanage, of living through the Second World War. I was collecting stories for a piece of theatre. As Barbie spoke, I noticed that she kept gravitating back to stories about the orphanage. She would say, "Oh, I couldn't abide living in the orphanage. I hated it there. They made us wear red in the orphanage. I've never been able to wear red since then." I went back a number of times, and every time I went back, she came back to this story. And I would say, "Yes, Barbie, you've told me about the orphanage. Tell me about something else now." And she said, "Oh, I didn't like the orphanage. Some of them were nice to us, but most of them were terrors at the orphanage. I mean, they made us wear red. I hate red. I could never wear red ever since then." And time after time, she came back to this story. And one day I found myself leaning forward when she wasn't looking and turning the tape recorder off. And that night I went back and I was talking to my flatmate and telling him about this. And Alex, my flatmate, turned around and said, "But isn't this interesting? Isn't this the thing she wants to talk about?" "Yes, I know, but I need material for my play. I can't have the person talk about the same thing again and again. But isn't this interesting?" So the next day, when I was with Barbie and she started to speak, I said, "Barbie, will you tell me about the orphanage?" And she started and she told me some of the same things. She didn't like red. They always made her wear red. And then she said this. She said that orphanage was divided in two by a big wall. And on one side, there were the girls, and on the other side were the boys. And the girls and the boys never mixed. We heard the boys in the playground, but we never mixed. "I had a brother the other side of that wall," she said. "I had a brother and I didn't know that until I was in my 40s. That's wicked, isn't it?" she said. "Isn't that wicked? I'd have loved to have had a brother." "My brother moved to Australia," she said. "I visited him once. I'll probably never see him now. Never see him again now." So why am I telling this story? Because I realized that that was an amazing example for me of the reciprocal relationship between listening and telling. My listening shaped what it was possible for Barbie to say. And when I opened up my listening, then Barbie was able to tell her story and to speak her truth. But my listening had been very narrow. I'd been seeking to get information. I'd been wanting stories for my piece of theatre, and my listening had been impacted by that. So why does it feel counterintuitive for us to be talking about listening and leadership? Well, One reason, I think, is because in leadership, there's a massive primacy given to speaking, given to the idea that our expertise, our experience, our leadership is demonstrated by what we say. So what pressure this puts on leaders? It puts leaders under pressure to have the answers, to solve the problems, to always be giving the direction. It puts the primacy on their words. I've got a little example of this from an experience I had a number of years back when I was coaching the lead partner in a law firm for his first Christmas speech to the whole partnership. And I remember sitting in this big foyer in central London. It was all glass and marble and high ceilings, lots of people in suits walking backwards and forwards in front of me. And I suddenly looked across and there was this small old man, bowed down, shuffling across the space. Collar of his suit was turned up, his head was bowed, and he got to the reception and asked the receptionist a question. And the receptionist turned and she pointed at me. And I realized that this was my coachee, and my heart sank in my stomach. And I got up and I put my hand out to say welcome to him and how do you do? And he stepped back from the hand that was out to shake him. And he said, no, I don't want this one. I don't want this one. I want the last one I had. I want the last one. And we spent the next 5 minutes persuading him that I was going to be his coach for the day. And we went down the corridors into this little meeting room. And I spent a couple of hours with him. But as soon as I got in the room, I could tell his shoulders were up, his jaw was clenched, his eyes were darting all over the place. And he sat down and he told me how petrified he was of this speech. My predecessor was fantastic at this. He was very urbane, he was very amusing, he did it all without notes. He fantastically spun this vision for the next year for the partnership. I can't do that. That's not me. And all I did with him for the next couple of hours was encourage him to slow down and give eye contact to his audience. But when I left that space, I realized that the pressure was on him to speak his leadership, that his words were what going to demonstrate what a good leader he was. And I discovered later that day from a colleague that he was one of the top 6 in the world in his area of law. So he was a fantastic subject matter expert, but he didn't enjoy the position he was put in, having to speak his leadership. So listening is the other side of our leadership. Listening is generative. Listening creates the space into which other people speak. Listening is not the absence of you speaking. So let's think about this a little bit further in terms of the relation to the issue for this whole conference. I want to go a little bit deeper into this idea of the reciprocal generative nature of listening. And then I'm going to take you into an example of working with a large global pharmaceutical company and how we looked at listening with them. But what I want to first identify is that this idea about listening is not just about how we listen to other people, it's about how we listen to ourselves. So at Narativ, we think of listening as a series of vessels. And if I introduce this image, well, here's a nice, wide, open bowl. If listening is a bowl, the shape of our listening absolutely dictates the shape of the liquid that's going to go inside it. So the shape of our listening dictates what is possible for people to say. There we are, the liquid filling the bowl dictated by the shape of the bowl. But there's many things that change the shape of our listening. And if we think of that lead partner in that law firm, what changed the shape of his listening of himself was that judgment he had about how he wasn't as good as the person before him. There's many things that can make our listening narrow. Let's have a think about that. So when I was working with Barbie, my listening was narrow my listening was very constrained to what I wanted to get out of that interaction. That changing the shape of that listening meant there was less space for her story to be told. So as I describe this idea of vessels changing shape, just reflect on what changes the shape of your listening. What are the circumstances? What are the people, possibly, that change the shape of your listening? And there'll be many things. In fact, these are great diagnostics of who changes the shape of our listening at what moment in time, because we'll have all had that experience of this ringing, us answering it or picking it up, seeing somebody's name, possibly seeing their face and going, oh, yes, what, no. That is very literally our listening changing shape in that moment of seeing that name at that time. Let's have a look at another example of a different shape of listening. So look at this. This is a wide open listening, but it doesn't go very deep. I had the experience recently of listening to the global head of HSBC standing on a platform talking about mental health. And he very openly talked about how his open door policy allowed colleagues and peers and team members to sit in front of him, and he very happily was able to listen to them talk about their health problems, their financial problems, problems with their children. But when they talked about their mental health, his listening became like this. His listening became very narrow because he didn't feel equipped to deal with the things that they were coming up with. So he immediately would pass them over to HR to deal with it. That's, I think, a great example of this kind of listening. I've got great capacity, but actually, when certain things come up, don't go too deep. I can't go any further. Here's another example. This is the kind of listening that has great capacity, but only if you can speak into that narrow neck of listening first. I remember preparing to give a lunchtime workshop in Reuters in Canary Wharf, and I was standing at the head of the door. People were coming in. It was open to anybody, and a man stopped me and asked some questions. What's this about? I told him a few answers to that question. What are you going to do? I answered with a few more sentences. He asked one more question, each time with this quizzical look on his face, and then he walked off. And I realized that I was speaking into that really narrow listening. There was something that he was waiting to hear me say, something that was going to unlock his attention for that full hour so he would step into the space and join us. He never joined us. I never got that key. And that is the difficult thing about speaking into this kind of listening. What is the narrowness that I'm speaking, and how am I going to unlock that person's attention? So here we are. These are just a few examples of how our listening changes shape and the kind of things that have an impact on the listening. And think about that for yourself. What are the things that change the shape of my listening? Who do I give habitually a narrow listening to, and why? And what might change if I didn't? What might change if I gave them a different kind of listening? And possibly, who gives me narrow listening, and how can I have an impact on that? I once left my phone on during a workshop, and I was probably at this point, I was talking about listening anyway, and it rang, and everybody in the room looked at my phone sitting down on my lap. And I picked it up, and it was a picture of my mum, and it said mum. And I went round the circle, and I showed everybody in the circle, and everybody smiled, and then I switched it off. And the whole room went, no. And I said, what are you talking about? If I answered this phone to my mum now, she will get very narrow listening from me. She'll get, Mum, I'm working, I'll speak to you later. But my mum's in her early 80s. And if my phone rang at 3 o'clock in the morning and it said mum, she would get that wide open bowl of my listening. So it's circumstantial. It changes with time. So one thing that it's worth us all identifying is that little habit we have of listening in order to. And I think for many leaders, this is a great trap. Listening in order to solve, in order to fix, listening in order to contradict, listening in order to take care of. And how can we suspend that so that our listening creates a much more open environment into which people can speak? So more and more at Narativ, we are noticing that there is an interest as much in our listening as in our storytelling work. We call it a listening and storytelling methodology. And I remember 3 years ago, sitting in our office on a sunny spring day on a conference call. And I was sitting there with my colleague, and there were 3 other people at the end of the line. And it was with this global pharmaceutical company. We'd already done a retreat for this company, and our sponsor for the retreat had then gone to his boss, and she'd then gone to her boss. And here we were now all together on this call. And the boss was the global head of leadership development for this corporation. And we talked for about 20 minutes about our work, and we talked about the tools that we work with, and we talked about the formats that a workshop could have. And then she stopped us and she said, you know, I think it's the listening. It's the listening that we really need. It's the listening that our leaders need, because the listening is a journey that they need to go on personally to understand how they listen to themselves, how they listen to other people, and what gets in the way. I remember putting the phone down and turning to Jane and saying, can you believe it? That's the first time we haven't had to persuade somebody that listening and storytelling go together. Because this woman sat there and she said, if it's about culture, then it's about listening. Because I don't think we listen well enough within this organization, both to ourselves and to our stakeholders outside. So what did we do with them? Let's have a look at an exercise that I did with them many times. And I'm going to invite you all to step into this experientially and take a look at what might be getting in the way of you being present with your listening now. It's a way of identifying what are the obstacles and distractions for all of us that occur in our listening moment to moment. So for a couple of minutes, I'm just going to invite you to close your eyes. I'm going to close my eyes. Of course, I will have no idea whether you're closing your eyes or not, but I'm going to invite you to, and spend a moment with me just focusing on our listening. And I'm going to draw your attention first to your body. Listen to your body. Notice what is going on inside your body. Is any part of your body calling your attention? What is your body saying to you? And I notice in running this exercise for you now in the middle of this conference, I'm just noticing things in my body being impacted by being in this space, presenting this to you. Now let's turn our attention to the environment around us. What do you hear? And if you have earbuds in, which many of you may do, take one out, because then you can really listen to the environment around you. What do you hear? And what comes into your mind? And now I'm going to get you to take your listening outside the space that you're in, into the rest of the building. What do you hear in the rest of the building around you? What do you hear? And notice what comes into your mind. And now I'm going to invite you to take your listening outside the building. What do you hear? Stretch your listening through doors, windows, and walls. And now be really athletic with your listening. How far can you stretch your listening? What do you hear and what comes into your mind? And now bringing your listening back into the building, back into the room that you're sitting in, back into your body. Is your body saying anything different to you now? And take a breath. And open your eyes and bring yourself back into the space. So, thank you very much, everybody who joined me with that. This is an opportunity to observe, identify, and then let go of the obstacles and distractions. So I'm just going to draw attention. If you want to, you can jot notes down about what you noticed in that 4-minute meditation of listening. So do jot things down for yourself. But what you will notice is that there were things going on in your body. I very specifically drew attention to what was going on in your body. The physical is a great area where we have obstacles and distractions. Things going on in our bodies, discomforts, physical needs. You might have noticed those as we did that. Bits of your body that are aching, that are stiff, that feel out of place. It could be physical needs like hunger, thirst, hot, cold, needing to go to the bathroom, those kind of things. There's a lot going on in our bodies, and that is a first place to start when we're looking for distractions and obstacles. The next is environmental. Now, around us all, there's sights and sounds. You had your eyes closed then, but in any working space, you will have lots of potential distractions. And we all know that loud noise around us can be very distracting, as can exciting activity that we see in front of us. In this world where we meet on Zoom and Teams, on these squares that we have in front of us, there are multiple distractions. You might have notifications coming through, even as we speak, emails, messages, WhatsApps, little things that you want to watch or look at. These are all potentially obstacles and distractions to us being present and giving our listening to the person that's in front of us. Next, you're going to have internal things. And I kept saying, notice what's going on, notice what's in your mind. And that's going to be flights of fancy with the imagination. But it's also going to be anything that takes you out of this moment in time into a future moment through anticipation, anxiety, things you have to do, to-do lists. It's going to be things you haven't done. It's going to be the past, what happened yesterday, this morning, last night, last week when you were 10 years old. So this present moment that we sit in has all the past and all the future crowding in on it. And it can be very hard to allow those to just disappear, to become present. So the internal is a great big category. Another one will be meaning making. It's what we do with those thoughts and feelings that pop into our head, the judgments that we have about them, because we live on this spectrum of like, don't like, agree, disagree, yes, no. As we were doing that exercise, you may have had things coming up. I love things like this. I hate things like this. What's this got to do with storytelling? This is fantastic. I mean, those are two ends of the spectrum and there's everything in between. But the judgments, I don't know how to do this. I'm not good at this. Judgments that go in towards us as well as out towards the world. And it's a very easy space for us to get lost in, that judgmental meaning-making space, becoming an obstacle in us listening to the person in front of us. And the last category I'm going to call relational, because it's about the difference that we experience listening to one person because of our relationship to them, and another because of different relationship. And within any organization, there's hierarchical relationships, which will absolutely have an impact on our listening. We will listen to our boss different than we will listen to our peer, than we will listen to our direct report. So these are the categories of obstacles that we have to contend with every moment of the day. And it takes some practice to do this. And we have to be compassionate about this because it's a moment-to-moment thing, allowing ourselves to be present, to clear our listening. I'm going to give you that exercise as a practice to try. We call it clearing listening. As I've said, it's an opportunity to observe, to identify and let go. And you can do this very quickly and easily, and particularly in this Zoom world that we live in, where we move from meeting to meeting. We no longer have the journey walking down the corridor or to another building or getting on a train for a meeting. Meetings happen then and they finish and another one starts. And what would it be like if we could buy ourselves the space between meetings to take a minute to just clear our listening? What don't I need that is going to get in the way and be an obstacle for me as I move into this next meeting? So there's an example of one of the things that we did with this global pharmaceutical company. And we worked with them for 18 months on 2 leadership programs. The first was with 250 of their global leaders. And the second was with 300 of their HR leaders. And what did they say at the end of this? Well, they said, we never do this. We never give ourselves time for this, and we never give ourselves permission. And actually, where they landed was that as part of a large piece of organizational transformation, this idea of addressing the leaders listening was key to the journey that the leaders were going to go on to enable this organizational transformation. In fact, they said there is no such thing as organizational transformation. There is only personal transformation. So they were identifying that it doesn't feel like there's time to listen, that there's actual great primacy given to speed of action, speed of decision making. And actually, if we don't give ourselves time, then what are we missing, they started to say. Because we need to create the space for creativity and innovation. We need to create the space for diverse voices, for different perspectives. And if we don't do that, we are never going to move forward. So this was the realization that this global pharmaceutical company came to. So let's bring this to a close. I started by saying that listening is generative. And I started with the idea that listening is not the absence of you speaking. Listening creates the space. Listening makes possible other people's stories. So that's where I want to leave it. Our mission statement at Novartis is our mission statement at Narativ is a world connected by listening and telling personal stories. So we always put the listening first. But your job as a leader is create the open listening for yourself and for the people around you, and that will release the stories. Thank you very much. And tomorrow, this idea of releasing the stories with her presentation called Everybody Has a Story.
Yes, we can't wait till Jane gets here. Dan, it was absolutely stunning. And we still have time for a little Q&A here.
Fantastic.
We have a wonderful question. Let me just read it out to our audience. How do we stop ourselves from being judgmental when in the listening space? Maybe some easy steps to catch ourselves in the obstacles that you've described, because it's not like the time to, it's not always there, it seems.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think, well, the simple answer is it's impossible to stop ourselves being judgmental. I mean, the judgments that we have, that we develop, are designed to keep us safe a lot, to help us operate in the world. The first stage is to identify. to notice and identify. And we have a very compassionate approach to listening. It's never sorted, it's never fixed, it's moment to moment. And the first thing to do is to identify and notice. It's about self-awareness, really. Notice those judgments and notice what might be causing those judgments. It's impossible to lose judgment. So just have that self-awareness to notice, and then notice when actually I don't need this judgment and it's going to be useful if I let it go.
Lovely. The key is in the noticing part. That's like in meditation.
Absolutely. You're never fixed. It's like with yoga. You don't do one downward facing dog in yoga and know you never have to do it again. It's a practice, listening. And just as storytelling is a practice. And I think it's the preparation practice for really good storytelling.
Exactly. Here's one question, and I would actually take it and reform it a little bit. The original question sounds like this. How do we share that? Wait, the slides are coming back off. Okay. Let's just leave the slides there for organizing team. We leave the slides there.
Great.
These are the contexts. You can get the head of them here. So the question was, how do we share that with our leaders, this feeling, without getting them offended, knowing that they may be not present? And I would even build on that. How can we make sure that a person that is clearly not listening the way that we need him to listen right now, or he would be like happy to listen right now, how can we nudge him in this direction of a better listening mode?
That's great. So 2 sides to that. How can we identify this without offending somebody? It has to start with you. How you focus on your listening is going to have an impact on other people. How you listen to him or her is going to have an influence on how that person operates. You can't force somebody else to listen in a different way if they're not identifying why they need to. And so it's a very personal journey that it starts with you. You change your listening of other people, and that will have an impact on them.
I like this phrase, start with your listening, and then it transformed the others. I remember a time when in the university we had this young girl. She always, before answering the question, took a pause for 4 seconds, and literally all the room, no matter how large, just went quiet before her answer. That's a kind of, start with yourself. So awesome.
So that was a great technique because she got everybody's listening, but actually that may well have just been for her to gather herself, feel connected, feel present, think about what she wanted to say before she said it.
Yeah, exactly. Wonderful. Dan, thank you so much. I still have one question for you, and I'm just going to drop the slides and leave the links here once again. So if you want to connect with Dan and Narativ London, links are in the chat. Then
Fantastic.
I have one phrase that I want you to complete for me as the speaker. So let's imagine Her Majesty, the story, came alive to teach the leaders one thing. If that happened, that one and only one thing would be?
It starts with your listening.
Lovely. Short and clear. It starts with listening. Yes, and we've learned a lot about how to do it, and we will be exploring it further. I saw Jerome there in the chat, and
Great.
Jane will be connecting tomorrow. So Dan, thank you so much. It was a gift to listen to you, and this exercise was beautiful. Let's praise Dan for his amazing presentation with the fires and the pluses in the chat.
Thank you so much for inviting us. Thank you, Artem.
It's a pleasure.